Hi, this is Don Carter. I'm making this video for my counseling and coaching clients, and if you're in the Serenity Cafe Academy membership, then this might also be helpful for you. What I want to do is go over the models that I use for my integrative approach to therapy. And I've been doing this about 35 years, and I've accumulated my own models and adapted other models and integrated them together, hence the term integrative psychotherapy. I think a lot of flexibility is very helpful in helping people recover from their trauma. Now, that's a big word, trauma. I guess I need to start with that. We're talking about emotional woundedness primarily. And if we grow up in a less than nurturing family, there's two ways that we can be emotionally wounded. One is through the things that people do to us, if we've had any verbal or physical or sexual abuse. And the other kind is for things that people don't do for us, which would include meeting our developmental dependency needs for time, attention, affection, and direction. So before we get into all that and how to use these models in healing those kind of wounds, I guess I need to start with a little brief introduction to neuroplasticity. There's a lot we've learned in the past 10 to 15 years, and a lot more of it is applicable in a clinical situation, therapy that is, and it helps us to really understand what's going on when just before we would use our intuition to kind of help people based on what we knew about psychology and biology and so forth. But neuroplasticity has really put a sharper focus on the change process and how to go about helping someone heal. So basically, we'll start with this image of a brain cell. And not all brain cells look exactly like this, but these are all the fundamental parts of a brain cell. There's trillions upon trillions of brain cells in our brain. And they are like little supercomputers. If you notice the red branches out here around this bigger part of the cell, those are called dendrites, and they receive the electrical chemical impulses from other brain cells, and they then would manufacture based on the chemical messages they receive. They've got a place in here to manufacture what we know as neurotransmitters and other brain chemicals according to the message they receive. And once they've produced and packaged up groups of neurotransmitters, they will fire off another electrical impulse, and that would carry those chemicals down to the end of the brain cell, which is the axon, that axon terminal down here at the end. Let me see if I can get in a position to be a little more helpful. So these terminals down here then join with other brain cells. And they don't exactly join with the brain cells. They'll join in a synapse, which is where an axon comes close to the receptor sites in the dendrite for the next cell. And you'll see there's a gap in here, and you'll see these little yellow packages at the end of the axon. Those are called vesicles, and they carry the neurotransmitters. And when that electrical impulse fires off, it releases a package of those chemicals out into the space where then they're available for use. And then they find their receptor site, and they go into the dendrite of the next cell, and the message gets passed on. It's very sophisticated. These are supercomputers. They are incredible when you get to looking at how they're made, and down to the fine little fibers and microfilaments and so forth that are used. And again, there are trillions and trillions of these that are all connected together in a neural circuit. And so let's take a look at this artist rendition of what a neural network would look like. And this is a matrix of, looks like tangled up web here, but there's layer upon layer of dendrite and axon connections making up various neural networks. Now, I could put a little circle around that and say that's a neural network, but it's not really that simple. There might be a dendrite over here and some activity over here that's connected with some activity down here, and then some activity over here. And it could be they're spread all over the brain like that. And so then these might form a network also. So it's not real cookie cutter. It's very flexible. And we call it neuroplasticity now because these parts of the brain, this web of our matrix of neuronal connections are malleable. In other words, they're plastic. They can be shifted and changed. And as a matter of fact, every 15 minutes when you're learning something new, you're growing a new dendrite connection or you're recruiting one that's not used for another connection. 2 rules for neuronal growth or reconnection. Hebe's law is what it's called. The first rule is neurons that fire together wire together. So when a group of neurons fires together frequently, the more they fire, the stronger the connections become. The stronger the connections, the more activity there is, and the more encoding takes place. Now, you may have a neural network that is not very active, and so the other principle is use it or lose it. Neuronal connections or dendrites can be recruited for other networks and other functions within the brain. So with that basic understanding, I'd like to jump into one of my first models, and this one comes from transactional analysis, and TA was developed by someone named Eric Byrne back in the 60s, and it's a very simple way of looking at different neuronal connections or neural networks. And they didn't call them that back then. They called them ego states. And there are a lot of different names for them. There's parts and ego states and different names people use. But just taking a look at this one, let me change my pointer here. If you take a look at this inset right here, this is the very basic structural diagram of ego states. It's the foundational ego state map. It's first order. And in the ego state model, there's a parent part of our personality, an adult part, and a child part. And of course, the child parts are created in childhood, and then the other 2 develop along the way. The child ego state is what we can call first position, or all about me, what I want, what I need, what I feel. That's the position of subjectivity. If you jump up to the parent ego state, it's a second position, which is all about them or they. This is the position of empathy. It's the ability to put yourself in their shoes. It's what they want, what they need, what they feel. So parents are all about children. And the parent ego state contains all of the shoulds and the musts and the ought tos. I call it the book of shoulds that go with parenting and how life should be. And the child ego state is all about having fun and stimulation and structure and so forth. So every child needs a parent. And the parenting that we get is stored up in the parent ego state, and the childhood experiences in the child ego state. Now, this one in the middle is the adult ego state. I call that one the CEO of the self. It's third position, or the position of objectivity. This is the part of us that's unencumbered by emotions. I like to call it the CEO because it's where all the executive functioning takes place. And that would be problem solving, decision making, grocery getting, bill paying, life functioning. And that's all, like I said, unencumbered by emotions. So that's what the first order ego state map looks like. Now this one is the second order ego state map. And there's a parent, adult, child here, but there's also a parent, adult, and a child in the child. And you've seen a baby pushing a buggy and pretending to play mommy at 4 or 5 years old, maybe, and that's because their little parent ego state is forming, and it's forming by taking in the lessons modeled by mom and dad. So that becomes the adapted child ego state, or the parent in the child. This one here is the adult in the child, this little professor. That's the computer without very much programming. By the time we get grown up, we have a lot of life experience, and we've encoded a lot of neural networks, and we have a lot of how-tos. But in the beginning, we just have some basic programs. The little professor has ingenuity, creativity, just a lot of ability to be flexible, and it's really the subconscious mind of the child. And so it's the little professor or the little adult in the child. And then we have the natural, fun-loving child. That's the pure kid. That's the one that will embarrass you at Applebee's or out at the restaurant because it likes to do whatever it wants. It might belch in public. It might make funny sounds. It might be a brat. It might giggle and laugh. It might be very cute. This is the unbridled energy of a pure child. The adapted child comes along and helps to temper that dynamic there in the child ego states. So we have here in the second order ego state map, we have a parent, adult, and a child in the child, and they're called the adapted child, the little professor, and the natural child. Okay, so the third order ego state map has the parent, adult, child, and then a parent, adult, child in the child, and then in that adapted parent part of the personality in the child, there are three other ego state maps, metaphorically speaking. There is the critical parent, the angry, defiant child, and the vulnerable, needy child. The angry, defiant child is the one that will dig its heels in and be defiant, or it'll throw temper tantrums and be angry. That's the fight mode that we'll talk about later. The vulnerable or needy child is the youngest part of our personality. It's the first part that comes into existence. When we're an infant, we're totally vulnerable, totally needy, and without a caretaker, we'll die. So there's a primal need for connection, a primal need for caretakers to help us. And then there's the critical parent, which takes in all the negative should, musts, and ought tos. This is where the inner critic can come from, and that's the part that says I'm not good enough, or I'm not lovable, or I should not trust women, or I should not trust men, or it's where all the negative or limiting beliefs can come from, that critical parent. It's not really a parent, it's a child pretending to be a parent, and it takes in all the negatives, but it also can take in you should look both ways before you cross the street. So it has some good beliefs that are not limiting. It's the limiting ones that we want to focus on here. Okay, so this just gives you an idea of how to make sense out of this neural matrix here and how we can see how the ego states are laid out. And that's just one model that I use and then we come back to, and it's embedded and integrated into the other models that we're going to look at. So this is another model here. This is adapted from the structural dissociation diagram. That's a recent product of neuroplasticity research and clinical studies, and it helps us to really start to apply what we're learning about the brain and central nervous system to our therapy. So before we get into that, let's take a look at this model of the iceberg. And I want to remind you that a lot of these models are included and explained in depth in my Serenity Cafe lifetime membership, or if you're a client, whether it's a coaching or counseling client, online or in the office, you'll have free access to all those videos and everything in there. And there's also my books about the iceberg, Thawing the Iceberg. So this is what I think of as my practice model that I've put together over the past 35 years, and it integrates a lot of what we're talking about here today. So the iceberg represents a person, and the water line represents a dividing line between what's in our conscious mind, our awareness above the water, and what's in our subconscious mind below the surface. And the deeper beneath the water you go, the deeper into our subconscious we go. So I want to start, I'm just going to briefly explain this because you can go back and look at that in the video. It's about 30 minutes long. It's a very entailed video, but I want to look at this part here. This is just beneath the surface, and this is emotional woundedness, and this is the core or the target for healing that causes us to have a lot of reactivity and difficulties in relationships and so forth, and difficulties with depression or anxiety or other things as well. If we grew up in a less than nurturing family, then we didn't get our needs met fully and completely. So this abandonment down here, what that means is that my needs were not met, and they were abandoned. I'll give you an example. Like when I'm an infant, if I come into a less than nurturing family, let's say mom and dad have alcoholism or drug addiction or some other illness going on, and they're all wrapped up in the dysfunction of that, then I'm not going to reliably get all my dependency needs met fully. And when a baby comes into the world, when they're wet, they need change. When they're tired, they need a nap. When they're hungry, they need fed. When they're fussy, they need soothed. And they need caretakers who are attentive and in tune enough to be able to evaluate what that child needs. The only way a baby has to express its needs is to cry. Over the years, they get a little more sophisticated, or over the months, they get a little more sophisticated in how they cry, and caretakers hopefully adapt to that and can tell, oh, that cry means he needs a nap or she needs food. But if we don't have reliable, tuned in caretakers, then sometimes our needs get met and sometimes they don't. When they don't get met, then we get what's called attachment wounds. Attachment to a caretaker is, in the beginning of life, is critical. Called bonding is another term for it. But if we have attachment wounding, then we're going to have wounded attachment styles in our adult life until we heal those attachment wounds. And again, there will be videos that talk all about that, so I don't want to go into great length on it right now, other than to say this is where the emotional wound sets in down here. Okay, now then, like any other wound, there's an infection that can set in. In this case, it's shame. The infection of shame is that voice that comes along that says, you're not good enough, you're not lovable, you don't matter. And it's that inner critic that comes up with a narrative about why I didn't get my needs met in the previous 3 to 5 years. It's because something's wrong with me. Before I'm 6 or 7 years old, I can't blame my godlike creatures who I call parents. So I make it about me. And that shame, that little core of shame starts to grow, and it develops a voice by the time I'm 7 or 8 years old. And that voice is about something being wrong with me, not being good enough. And so that's the emotional wound, the emotional infection. And here is the emotional scab, the scab of contempt. Contempt is all those crusty feelings of anger and bitterness and resentment. This the life sucks syndrome, if you will, and it's right close to the surface of my awareness. So that creates the scab of contempt, the infection of shame, and the wound of abandonment creates a free-floating mass of pain, emotional woundedness, emotional pain that creates a false self in a child. False as in not true, because they have a true self that we were born with. This stuff happened as a result of being born in a wounded family, and where most of us have some woundedness, mild, moderate, or severe, because our parents were wounded, and their parents were wounded, and their parents were wounded, and we can't demonstrate much more than we've been given. So at any rate, it's not an excuse, but it is an explanation, and it's not about throwing mom and dad under the bus. It's about really looking at what we started out with. And that emotional wound, infection, and scab is going to be the foundation of a lot of other problems later on until we get them healed. So because there's all that pain on the inside, we can't spend much time in there, so we have to develop an external focus and put on a mask or a cover-up to protect us from what's going on beneath the surface. And so that can be called your invented self. And there's like 4 classic masks that people wear when we're kids. The first child usually becomes the hero in the family, the flashy one or the responsible one. The second child is the scapegoat or the rebel, typically, because negative attention is better than no attention. And the first kid's got all the positive attention frequently. So then the third kid comes along and they're the lost child, and they're lost in the crowd. And then they get shy and withdrawn and kind of spend a lot of time off by themselves. And the fourth child is usually the mascot or the baby of the family. So there's more on that when you look at that video here too. But this is where codependency lives, the external focus, the cover-ups to try and control the impressions of everyone around me so they'll think the right things about me, and so I wear that mask or that public image. And still, I need to find some place to get comfort and relief for all this pain down here. And I can't find it inside because I can't really even go there. There's all that woundedness. And so what I do is I find something outside of me that gives me comfort and relief. Maybe at first it's food. Grandma starts with, here, have a cookie, it'll make you feel better. Or maybe I discover alcohol or pot or sex or gambling or work and success or drama, tornadoes in my life, or taking care of needy people. All of those things provide me with an external focus to keep my attention out here and some semblance of comfort and relief, at least in the beginning. Later on, as the addiction progresses, it then again feeds the abandonment, shame, and contempt, which feeds the need for more comfort and relief. So again, that's the basics of the iceberg, and that abandonment, shame, and contempt is important, and I wanted to go over that with you because it fits really well into this map of structural dissociation. So to start with, on the structural dissociation, I'll direct your attention to this upper tier where there are two boxes: self-actualization and self-preservation. In other words, growth mode and survival mode. Now, when we get triggered into survival mode, it lights up all these other things down here. And the whole structural dissociation map then becomes activated. But when we're not in survival mode and we're in growth mode, then we're free from all that and we're autonomous. And so we can say we're autonomous of the life scripts that we collected in order to manage the dysfunction around us. But when we get triggered into survival mode, then the whole configuration of life scripts will start up, and I will behave according to the strategies that different parts of me learned through the little professor's creativity in order to heal or in order to survive, basically. All right, so let's take a look at something else while we're here. This tier right here, these are normal survival responses, and we need to have normal survival responses to survive. They're not meant to be active 24/7, but if something bad were to happen, then we should be able to choose from an array of appropriate responses. For instance, if I'm in a dark alley and someone wants to mug me and I'm carrying a baseball bat, I might want to start swinging. And so that would be my fight part. If they got a gun, I might want to start running. That'd be my flight part. Or if I've been working all the time and I'm getting wore out and burned out, then I might want to push everything aside and run off to the lake or the beach for the weekend. And that's a healthy use of flight mode. If I'm sick or have the flu, then I want to collapse into the bed and freeze and give my body an opportunity to heal and overcome the illness. If I'm in a disagreement with my boss, I might want to defer to my boss and submit to his direction or her direction. Now, this part here is not necessarily a survival response, but it is the source of triggering a lot of these different responses. This is our attachment drive, the most vulnerable part of our personality that I spoke of earlier. And that's the part that has a desperate longing for connection, because without it, I'll die. When we first come into the world, we're totally dependent, totally needy, and we fear abandonment because it means death. And the only thing an infant can do is cry for help. And if that cry isn't answered, then they cry for rescue. They turn it up. They start screaming because this is a primal need. Okay, so if these needs are not met fully and completely, then my emotional gas tank starts to go down and I start to feel an emptiness or an ache or longing because my needs are being abandoned. And when that happens, the first 6 or 7 years of life, then I'll take one step to the left over here and I'll submit and I'll become a approval seeker, or I'll please and appease everybody. This is where I'll be all about them, what they want, what they need, what they feel. I might be the good boy or good girl. I'll self-sacrifice, put everyone else's needs ahead of my own. And all of this is driven by depression from unmet needs, or shame from that infection, and maybe even self-hatred from the contempt. You'll see that the submit part and the attach part are closely related, or connected over here. Now, the submit part is what is supposed to manage the impressions of everyone around me. So it's a manager part in the terms of ego, it's IFS, which is interfamily systems therapy. And this would be called a manager because it's trying to make sure everybody's thinking the right things about me. And so that's why I'm a good boy or a good girl, or I'm self-sacrificing or approval seeking, pleasing and appeasing. That's my job, to make sure everybody thinks the right thing so I can feel okay. Now, if I don't get them to think the right thing and somebody's mad at me, then a different manager will come on board. Let me get rid of some of these. The fight part, either internalizing it or externalizing all that contempt. When the submit part doesn't do its job and make sure everybody's happy with me, then the fight part is also a manager, and it manages the submit part, which manages the impressions of others. It does that by lobbing a shame grenade or a contempt grenade over here at the submit part. Why'd you say that? Why'd you do that? Why'd you wear that? What's wrong with you? Are you stupid? So the inner critic comes out, or the getting angry with myself and throwing a temper tantrum. Now, if I externalize it, then I criticize others and I get angry and I have a tantrum with them. So that's a lot of weight to carry for a kid, to learn how to try and make sure everybody's happy. And usually the people in their life are hard to please anyway. So they're going to have a lot more of these shame grenades, or shame attacks, as I like to call them, coming from the inner critic or the angry fight part of themselves. And this is the part, though, that helps us separate right here. It helps us maintain a sense of autonomy. And this is the part that helps us connect, the attached, vulnerable drive over here. And they're on the opposite ends of the spectrum. This one's a protector, and this one is just pure need over here. All right, so that's, again, a lot of weight, and, it's a lot of pressure to be under. I'm going to beat myself up if I don't make everybody happy and so forth. And so that part will kick in. And when that happens, that's a lot of stress and a lot of pressure. So then, because of all that stress and pressure, I have a flight part that maybe wants to kick in, and I want to distance myself or detach from my feelings. I might get into an addictive behavior. I might have poor self-discipline. It's the natural, fun-loving part of me that wants to go off and play, and there's a healthy use of that when I go to the lake and take a break after working so hard. But this is more about escape and addiction. And that's called a firefighter in the IFS model. And we go back here and we'll look at the iceberg again. Their firefighters are up here, and the managers are in here. So when the managers aren't managing things, then the firefighter comes in to douse all the flames. Okay, so that fight part is where we can get caught up in being that kid in a candy store without parental supervision and have all these different kind of addictive strategies and so forth to escape the fight part and the submit part. Now, when none of that works, then the freeze response may kick in. And the freeze response, I can tell that it's kicked in because I feel frozen or paralyzed or terrified or stuck. I'm afraid of being seen. I might not want to leave the house. I might just want to pull the covers up over my head, and I isolate socially, and I might have panic attacks because all the freeze responses are fear-based. And there's fear, there's anxiety, there's different forms of panic that set in. And then ultimately I'll shut down and collapse into it. So now the freeze part is an exile. And what that means, I collapse into the emptiness of the unmet childhood dependency needs. This is a part of me that I've pushed deep down inside because it's not something that can be in our face 24/7, feeling that emptiness and that pain. That's why the submit part, the fight, and the flight part kick in. Okay, I said a little earlier that this tier here, these are all healthy, natural fight survival responses. but they can also be toxic and they can become very dysfunctional. That's because of this abandonment, shame, and contempt. So I see that as a filter. It's a filter that runs between the survival mode and these parts here, and it taints all of these responses based on abandonment, shame, and contempt. And so there's internal threats that come with each one of these. If I'm beating myself up, or if I'm having a shame attack, or if I'm feeling abandoned or left out, then that's going to kick all these things on. So our goal in therapy is to heal the abandonment, shame, and contempt. And again, that would be beneath the surface over here. Okay, so that's a little bit about the life scripts and parts matrix model. There's a lot of different parts, and these sub parts under here are strategies that are created for survival. I have to remember that when I'm not triggered, then I'm in growth mode. When I'm in growth mode, I can do just fine. Again, I'm free and autonomous of all the life scripts that I've accumulated over the course of my life. But when I get triggered into survival mode, then all that stuff becomes active. Okay. So this takes us to this brain diagram. And of course, this is not to scale, and it's not actually authentic the way it is, but it gives us the model anyway. So imagine you're looking from the top down on top of someone's head, and at the top of the diagram up here is where the eyes are. Get this out here. So the eyes would be right up here. And so this is top down. So to go through this, you might not be able to see this very clearly here, but it says amygdala. The amygdala is a major element of the limbic system, or the emotional brain. It's not really in the back of the head. It's more like right here in the middle, and it's about the size of a walnut. But the amygdala is where all the emotional pain gets stored up. It's also connected to the hippocampus, which has to do with long-term and short-term memory. So all of that dysfunction that's stored up from childhood gets stored in the amygdala, and that's where all the reactive parts come from. All those fight, flight, submit, freeze, and attach parts that get reactive and get triggered are from here. Okay, so the amygdala responds to, well, we'll talk about some of this in a little bit, but the next part I want to look at is this part right here. And so if you're right-handed, then it'd be your dorsal prefrontal cortex, or the left brain. This is where that adult part lives, that what I call the CEO of the self. It's unencumbered by emotions. It's the left brain. It's the grocery getting, bill paying, job doing, executive functioning, problem solving, decision making part. And it's unencumbered by emotions because it's not connected to the amygdala. It's more like a computer that can analyze and so forth. But this is in the thinking brain. All of this up here is the thinking brain, and back here is the feeling brain. So this is the main element of the thinking brain, and that's the adult self. It's good for daily life functioning, managing, problem solving, etc. And it is aware of all these other parts. Now, in the right brain, which would be the non-dominant side if you're right-handed, is the self-soothing center. Now, what's supposed to be in there is we're supposed to have integrated or internalized healthy models of a mom and a dad, that I can use their their soothing skills to soothe my amygdala. The self-soothing center ideally would have those representations. Now, depending on how bad things were growing up, how wounded mom and dad were, what kind of dysfunction was going on. If I didn't get attachment wounds, I may have gotten some physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, and then that would put the wrong kind of models in that self-soothing center, and I might have difficulty then soothing those inner children, if you will. But some people, when they say things like, I'm not good enough, or I'm stupid, or I'm just not worth anything, And I ask them if they really believe that, and they say yes. And then I ask them, if you knew another 4 or 5-year-old niece, nephew, or son or daughter who said that to you, would you agree with them? And they, of course, would say no. It would be a no-brainer. I wouldn't agree with them. That's because I have a self-soothing center that can soothe other people outside of me. But all this adult resources right here was not available to me when I was a child. It's available now if I'm a parent, an uncle, an aunt, or an adult. Then I've taken in some representations of healthy adult behavior, and I can soothe or comfort a child outside of me. So what I have to do is be able to turn that inward and have that self-soothing center, see where it's connected here with the amygdala, have it available to help soothe the amygdala. Now, a lot of has been said about mindfulness these days. Mindfulness has shown on brain imaging scans and so forth to be something that is very healing and very, very comforting to the amygdala. And that's because this is the part that we do mindfulness from, this medial prefrontal cortex. And it's connected to the amygdala, and all it can really do is notice and regulate the amygdala by noticing, oh, that's my fight part, or oh, that's my submit part, or I feel frozen right now. And that's because I'm thinking, and this part helps and joins together, the going on with normal life part joins together with the noticing, mindful prefrontal cortex and sends in the soothing for that just by noticing. So all of these are called our adult resources. They're in our thinking brain, and these are the emotional reactive states that get triggered. So the right brain, the adult, can learn to use this part in order to help the various wounded parts. And again, the medial prefrontal cortex can only notice the parts, but also not only notice the parts, but also regulate the amygdala just simply by observing and noticing it and paying attention rather than distracting ourselves or falling into some addictive behavior. So the amygdala responds to the medial prefrontal activity by decreasing its own activity. If there's no connection here, then this is going to start to go wild. Okay, so when we get triggered into a reactive part, and again, a reactive part, let me just show you these parts here are reactive. They don't take any thought. We don't have to remember to do them. We don't have to supply any energy. We might not even be aware that we're coming from a reactive strategy. It's just something that gets triggered when we get triggered into survival mode. And when that happens, what happens to this thinking brain up here is that it goes offline. The adult resources are not available to the amygdala, and the amygdala drives those thoughts, feelings, and reactive parts. When the frontal lobes go offline, those parts are free to act and react at will, driven by an irritable amygdala. So you can think of it as a group home for troubled children without any parental supervision there. That's all that reactivity. And so what our task would be to get back to a dual awareness of having my thinking brain available to my amygdala so I can have all those connections. And there's a lot of therapies that are geared towards that, focusing on doing that. Like CBT, for instance, is really good for this part. And when I challenge my limiting beliefs and thoughts, then my noticer, my observing part, can notice that and send that to the amygdala. So that's soothing in a way to take away the I'm not good enough and say, oh, well, Bill just had a bad day. All right. So that's where CBT would work. Inner child work, IFS therapy, ego state therapy is all geared towards finding and developing healthy models to be there for ourselves and to provide self-care. It's important to remember, too, that the nurturing that we got from childhood tends to be proportionate to the self-care we demonstrate in adulthood. So the good news is we can change that, and we can start to develop healthy self-soothing and self-care skills. Okay, so let's go here And let's look at what happens when we get caught up in a reactive part. This is the drama triangle, Steve Karpman's drama triangle. I like it because it gives us the roles that we can play when we're reactive. So when we get triggered into these reactive parts, we have no choice but to become a victim or a persecutor or a rescuer. A victim, a persecutor, or a rescuer. And it's driven by feelings of either I'm not okay, you're not okay, or none of us are okay. It's a problem-focused survival mode. And so to give you an example how it works, let's say Dad's having a bad day at work, and he was supposed to have a report due, but he got up late in the morning. He still didn't have his report done, and he had a bad day the day before. He's got a new boss, and the new boss jumped all over him when he came into work this morning because he didn't have his document finished. And then he was so stressed out that he made mistakes all day, and the new supervisor was all over him. So Dad was a victim of the new supervisor who was the persecutor. And he had that stance pretty much all day. So he's real happy to get off work and come home, but it's still kind of keyed up with stress. And when he gets home, he finds little Johnny's bike in the driveway. And he told Johnny a dozen times at least to take the bike out of the driveway so Dad could pull the car up into the garage. So Dad has to get out and move the bike. And he notices while he's doing that little Johnny, who's 12 years old, hasn't taken the garbage out to the curb. And so now he's really starting to get miffed about that. And so he goes inside, and little Johnny's waiting expectantly for Dad to come in. Dad comes in, and he unloads on little Johnny, who becomes the victim. Of course, little Johnny starts crying, and Mom comes in and says, hey, you're not going to take out your bad day on Johnny just because you had a rough time. They get into a big fight, and Dad's saying, I was just trying to teach him a little work ethic. So then Dad feels like a victim and Mom's the persecutor, and they're fighting. And so little Johnny jumps to the rescue of Dad and tells him and jumps all over Mom for starting up with Dad. So you can see that all three roles, it's not assigned to anyone in particular, but we can shift from one to the other. And that's why it's called the drama triangle. And it's not something that we decide to do, and most people wouldn't do it, except for they're reactive at the time that they do. They're triggered into one of those reactive parts. This is the fight part. This is a flight or a submit part, and this is a submit part. And it's also a flight part. It's there to help the victim protect it from the persecutor. So that's our mindset whenever we're triggered into one of those reactive modes. So the alternative to that would be David Emerald's empowerment dynamic. This is an opportunity-focused growth mode. So it's different. In fact, it's flipped upside down. The triangle now is pointing up because the victim was in the down position. The opposite of a victim is a creator. I'm the creator of my own life. And that goes for whether something good is happening in my life or something bad. Usually, even if it's bad, I've probably played a part in that. And I've created the bad thing in my life by decisions I made, typically. I'll give you an example in my own case. A year ago, February, I was diagnosed with diabetes. And it hit me, when the doctor said I needed to go on medication, that I created this myself because I knew my family history. I knew my mom, my aunt, my sisters had diabetes, and I could develop it, but I ate whatever I wanted to. So I created that mess. And so I like to practice what I preach. And I wanted to, since I created it, I wanted to create a solution. So I didn't go on the medicine. What I did was to get a coach, or actually I got two coaches. I got two nutritionists that were very good and have all kinds of experience in a proper diet and exercise to walk back a diabetic problem. So I got these coaches. I did exactly what they told me to do. Every week I watched a 10-minute video, and then 10 or 15 minutes, and I'd sit down with them for 10 or 15-minute coaching session during the week. And my goal was to rise to the challenge. And since I didn't know what to do, I needed coaches to help me. But you notice coaches are not rescuers. The difference between a coach and a rescuer is if I'm playing a game of football, for instance, I don't know what to do, and I call a timeout, and I come to the sideline, I'll brainstorm with the coach, get some ideas, go back in, implement, and play the game. But if this was a victim or a rescuer on the sideline, then they would put me on the bench and try to go in and play the game for me. That's the difference there. So also in this model, there's no such thing as a persecutor or a problem. There's only an opportunity for growth or a challenge or a challenger. So in this case, my diabetes was the challenge that I had to rise to. And so with my coaching and my decision making and so forth, within 3 months, I'd lost 30 pounds and I was well under even the pre-diabetic range, which was just an example of what we can do when we're in growth mode. And usually that comes from a place of, I'm okay, I can do this, and other people are okay and they can do this. But spiritually speaking, for me, it also comes from knowing that I have the energy, double energy here, of being able to tap into my spiritual true self and connect with God's spiritual self, which is the Holy Spirit in my case. And that helped me a lot too. So the empowerment dynamic is about being my own creator, creating the life that I want, seeking out coaching when I need it, and looking at everything as a challenge or an opportunity for growth, not a problem, not a persecutor, and I'm not a victim. Even if it's cancer or something else that you don't have any explanation for, it's a challenge. It's not a persecutor or a problem that's going to weigh you down. You don't want to see yourself as a victim. You want to learn everything you can, get all the coaching and do all the right things and try to rise to that challenge and bring all your spiritual resources to bear on that as well. So it's really that neither one of these are true or false. You just have to ask yourself, which one of these models is going to be more productive? This one or that one? If I surrender to a disease like cancer or something else, then I'm not going to be helping myself too much. If I want the optimal chance of beating it, then I want to get in this mode. But I cannot be in this mode unless I'm in growth mode. I have to be from here. Okay, so that's the drama triangle and the empowerment dynamic, and that's how they fit in here. This is growth mode, and this is survival mode. So the next model I want to get into is what I call my map of the world. I'm going to run through this one pretty quick. This is how I input data, I process it, and I output it. This is how I get out of the frying pan right back into the fire many times. So let's take a look at this real quick. So we are able to interface with our world from sensory connections. We can see, touch, taste, smell, and hear. And so the world is anything outside my own skin. And I take in all the data from around the world through my sensory apparatus, these sensory channels of what I see, hear, touch, taste, and smell. So I look at this area right here as the doorway to my subconscious mind. And it's really a space in the brain. It's called the reticular activating system, and it works in conjunction with the thalamus and some other parts of the brain that have secondary roles. But the reticular activating system and the thalamus have a majority of the say-so on how much data comes into my brain for processing. So what's coming at me at any given moment is about 2 million bits of hear, see, feel, sensory data. It's trying to bombard me and bust in through that doorway and get into my subconscious for processing. But my brain cannot possibly process 2 million bits of data per second. In fact, I'm lucky consciously to hold on to 7 bits, like the 7 digits in a phone number. But subconsciously, the subconscious can process a lot more than the conscious mind. It can process about 40,000 bits of data. But which data do I let in? That's up to the doorman of the subconscious mind, the reticular activating system, because he has a flip chart or a clipboard. And that clipboard has names on it. And if those names fit with the experience trying to get in, then it will be allowed in if it fits those mental filters. Now, let me make this a little bigger and we'll take a better look at it. Okay, so these mental filters right here, these are strongly held personal beliefs. I've got strongly held beliefs about my spirituality. I've got it about my identity, who I am, my values and beliefs, and I have strongly held beliefs about my memories and experiences in my life and my programs, like how to do my job or how to tie my shoe or how to be a friend, and then my survival needs. Those strongly held beliefs about all of those things are my mental filters. And if some of this data, the sensory data, fits with these strongly held beliefs, then the doorman will let it in. But if it doesn't, then it will delete it. It won't let it in. So I gave an example of how that works. Let's say John comes to counseling. He's 45 years old, and he says, I'm not worth caring about. And it makes me feel depressed and anxious, and life's not worth living. I'm 45 years old. It's all I've ever known. I even know where it came from. My dad, who's an alcoholic, used to call me worthless and no good, said I'll never amount to anything and nobody could ever love me. Turns out he was right, because I never found anyone who cared about me. Now, a counselor notices that John's been married for 45 years. 15 years, let's say. John's been married for 15 years. And he says, well, what about your wife? And John says, no, she doesn't even care about me. When the counselor says, well, I'm going to check that out. Sunday is the Super Bowl. Why don't you just invite me over to watch the Super Bowl as a friend, and we'll just I'll just be there and I'll be able to observe and see how she's treating you. Now, of course, counselors don't really do that, but in this case, he did. And so the counselor came and sat through the Super Bowl with John, and the next week they met in session. And counselor says, John, I counted 63 times that your wife said something caring to you over the weekend. John said, what are you talking about? I didn't count even one. And so that happened because the generalization here is John's strongly held belief that he's not worth caring about. And since caring messages might have been delivered, but they were deleted right away because they don't fit the mental filter, a strongly held belief that he's not worth caring about. We even have ways of saying that when we delete information. It's like, that went right over his head, or that just didn't register at all, or that went in one ear and out the other. So that's deletion. Now, the counselor in this case had a tape recorder in his pocket, and he taped all those caring messages, and he played them back for John in session. So what do you think John did? He made an excuse for each one of those. They would be considered caring, except for, oh, she just said that because you were there, or, oh, she was just wanting something, or had some other distortion, because he couldn't let in any of this data if it did not fit that strongly held personal belief that he's not worth caring about. So if he couldn't delete it, he had to distort it. That's where our mental defense mechanisms come in: rationalizing, blaming, projecting, intellectualizing, and so forth. Those distortions then trigger something called confirmation of the existential position. It's like when something fits one of my strongly held personal beliefs, then I get this weirdly satisfying emotional charge. And even if it's negative, and I might say, dang it, I knew that was going to happen. Why did I even take a chance again? Why did I even risk it? So that makes the strongly held belief even more true, and creates stronger connections for those beliefs. All right, so the takeaway from how we process and let in all that data is that any data that gets in because of generalization, deletion, and distortion is biased data. It has to fit the mental filters of subjectivity. It has to fit with my reality. And so I look for only data that will support what's already there. Now, that's the subconscious input. And then the processing is that I create these maps. Like I have a map for how to do my job, a cognitive map, if you will. It's a neural network that's encoded with information like how to do my job, or how to tie my shoe, or how to recite the alphabet, or how to read a book, or how to cook a meal, build an engine, whatever. I've got a whole room full of maps on how to do all that. So let's say that I'm a codependent man, and I just got out of my third horrible toxic codependent relationship. Only it's been 6 or 7 months, and I've been healing up pretty well, and my buddies think it's time for me to get back into the world. And so they set up a little party, and they invite 50 women to the party. 49 of them are healthy as can be. Which one do you think I end up with? The one that's not healthy is an addict or an alcoholic. Who do you think I end up with? That's right, the alcoholic or the addict. I might come into the room and move around the room, and all of my strongly held personal beliefs are leaking out into the room around me through what's called paramessages. It's little micro messages that are in how I walk, how I carry myself, how I talk, the things I respond to, the things I don't respond to, how I look, a raise of an eyebrow, the shaking of a head, or how I respond. There's thousands and millions of bits of data in those paramessages. So I'm like walking into that room, leaking out of every pore of my body, my love map, how I do love. And any interested women in the room are leaking out of all their pores their love map, how they do love, their energy. And it's all through those paramessages. It's like pheromones. So I might walk in, talk to the first one. She's pretty healthy. And so nothing really clicks. I'll talk to the next one. And then I see that one over in the corner. She looks interesting. I like the way she flips her hair. She looks like she's having a good time. So I go talk to her, and she's pretty interested too. So we get this little energy going, and we're talking, and there's all of a sudden the earth moves, or lightning strikes, or chemistry hits. That's because our love maps were compatible. There's a lot of subconscious auditioning going on in that room, in that conversation. Outwardly, consciously, we're both putting on our best selves, acting with our best manners, saying all the right things, and so forth. But subconsciously, there is a lot of information being exchanged. I call it a subconscious audition for our next relationship. And when enough of those mental filters are tripped, existential positions and strongly held beliefs are activated, then I find myself having some chemical reaction called chemistry with this person. And then we have this infatuation period. It lasts a few weeks or months. And then, wow, I wake up with an alcoholic or an addict. And how did all that happen again? So that's how we input, process, and output our data. And it's all about different parts of self. And so these are important because it's these core beliefs or these mental filters that are contained within all those ego states, all those parts of self. If you go back here to the fight part, it has its own core beliefs, and the flight part also does, and then the freeze part and the submit part, they all have their own core beliefs, even the attached part, and that's where the codependency can come from, is right here, the submit part. But each of those have their own language, and we want to learn what that language is. So just to give you an idea, if it's coming from my attachment drive, then the language is usually a language of connection or relationship. You'll hear things like abandoned or lost or lonely or left out or disconnected. The submit part has emotional themes of depression and shame. So I'm not good enough, I'm less than, is the language that you'll hear coming from that part. I got to work pretty hard to make sure everybody's happy with me, or I might not be able to stay in this relationship. And then the freeze part is a language of fear, panic attacks or phobias or anxiety that are just off the charts most of the time. And then the flight part gets activated when I feel trapped and I want to escape, or I'm overwhelmed and I want to get away from all that. So, and then the fight part has angry and critical language. So that's how you'll recognize those. And they all have their own core beliefs about themselves, about other people, and about the world in general. Now, this does not mean there's multiple personality disorder. A lot of times I get that question. What it means is you're human, that we all have many different parts. But I am Don. I am not a part, but Don has many parts. You are you, and you have many parts. But the core self, the whole personality, is right here. It's when we're in growth mode. It has access to all of our adult resources, and it's able to apply all of that to the feeling brain. Okay, so let's take a look at one of the things that we can do in order to zoom in on the core beliefs and the parts of self that are being activated. So if we look at a CBT model like this Precision CBT that I combined with my LSPM model, so the A here equals activating event or the trigger. Something happens. Usually I just notice, first of all, the emotional response, and then I have a behavioral choice, and then that starts another activating event. But the main thing is this belief system that creates this emotional response, and then I go to my favorite behavioral choice, right? So the belief system is the one I got to take a look at. So whenever I'm triggered and I don't like my emotional response or my behavioral choice, I have to look at what part just got triggered. Was it my fight part, flight part, freeze part, submit part, or attachment part? If it was attached, it's about relationship and connection. If it's submit, it's about not feeling good enough. If it's freeze, it's anxiety and fear. If it's flight, it's being trapped and want to get away. And if it's fight mode, then there's anger and criticism there, and I lash out or I lash in at myself. So if I look at the emotional response, if I'm feeling lonely or not good enough or anxious or trapped or angry or critical, then I know what part it is. If I look at my behavior, if I'm lashing out at someone else or lashing in at myself, it's my fight part. If my behavioral choice is an addictive or distracting behavior, then it's my flight part. If I'm stuck, frozen, isolating, can't get out, and I just hole up in my house, then it's my freeze part. If it's people pleasing and taking care of others and what they want, what they need, and what they feel, it's my submit part. And if it's depression and feeling no good or disconnected, then my behavioral choice will be to have a fear of abandonment reaction or need for reassurance or a dismissive attitude. We have to look at those when we get into all the attachment wounds at some point. Okay, so when I've been able to identify which parts were reactive, the survival mode that got triggered, I can start to play at the possibility, and then I want to look at the parts of me that that I can bring to bear to help reprogram those reactive parts or soothe those reactive parts. So in my growth mode, I have to decide to go to my self-soothing center and activate my nurturing adult self and have it talk to those parts, or my protective adult self and have it stand up for those parts, or maybe my true spiritual self and bring God's healing to the picture, or just my CEO of the self and do a little CBT, play with some possibilities. And instead of Bill yelled at me because I'm not good enough, it's Bill yelled at me because he's having a bad day. And so I can take the B1, which is the belief system, and the C1 of consequence 1 and C2 consequence 2. If I don't like that in that red space there, then I find here healthy alternative, and I find a new meaning that might be more accurate. I challenge the negative limiting one because all of those beliefs that are reactive come from the past, not the present moment. But whatever happens in the present moment can activate a lot of these parts of self. So that's where CBT and the LSPM model can fit together. Okay, so one other model that I use quite a bit is this functional ego state map. If you remember, we looked at the first, second, and third order structural ego state maps. Those are just about seeing where all the parts fit together and so forth, or the general parts that we all have. This one is the same thing, but it's more about how they function. If you look at the adult part, which is that getting on with normal life part, that's the mindful here and now focus. That's the problem solving, grocery getting, job doing, bill paying part of self that does normal life and it's unencumbered by emotions. But it's integrated with a positive protective parent and a positive nurturing parent. It's connected to integrated natural fun-loving self, positive natural child, and a positive adapted child. And then these red quadrants on each of these areas here are the negative. Negative protective parent, positive protective parent, negative natural child, and negative adapted child. So on the back of this card, I have all the definitions of that. Like a negative protective parent is that punitive or demanding critical parent ego state that tries to control self and others with shaming messages and should, must, and ought to rules. The positive protective parent is the part of self that takes charge in a directive but non-shaming way when someone is in immediate danger, such as when a loved one's too drunk to drive or too depressed and they're talking about suicide. Then I want to become a positive protective parent and I want to take over, even if it's my spouse or brother or sister, whoever. So we have all the descriptions of when it's positive, when it's not helpful. The adult ego state, again, is that out front, leading the way part that gathers information, solves problems, and makes logical decisions. So there we have a connection between all those models. We have the ego state model. Then we have the structural dissociation model, the iceberg model, the diagram of the brain and the parts of selves that can get triggered. And then we have this drama triangle and empowerment dynamic. And how we make our maps of the world, and all that fits together. And then how to identify which is which. And then again, we can take a look at the functional ego state map to identify where I'm at with all that. The green zone is the integrated zone, and the fringes of my personality are where I get triggered, and the adult is not connected to that. One other thing I'll add is an idea about fragmented self. And so the green zone, again, is integrated. The red zone is fragmented. So you'll notice each of these ego states has quadrants that are not connected, really. So if you imagine a fragmented self means, like, if you imagine the self as a ceramic baseball, you come into the world, life throws you a curve, and you get hit by a bat. What happens to that baseball? That's right, it'll shatter, and you'll get a bunch of little satellite pieces floating around this core chunk that's still functioning. The core chunk of that ceramic baseball then is the self that continues to grow and self-actualize. But these little fragments are disconnected and floating out here to the side, and they can be triggered. I'll give you an example. If let's say an 8-year-old boy walks into a dark room, he smells garlic, the door slams shut, it's pitch black in there. Bang! He's getting beat up and traumatized. 8 years old. 30 years later, a 38-year-old man walks in that dark room, smells garlic, and the door slams shut. Those three elements equal, I'm going to get the tar beat out of me. I'm going to get traumatized. So there's a panic attack. And suddenly the 38-year-old man feels like an 8-year-old boy with panic and his dreadful feeling that he can't understand where it comes from. In this case, he doesn't remember the original attack, but his body keeps score and his body remembers, so he gets triggered out into that by those three elements being present. Then when he comes back to himself, then he can say, whoa, where'd that come from? And later on find out that it's a repressed memory. Now, some memories are repressed and some aren't, but I can get triggered into a reactive part of myself that easily. And so integration is about pulling the baseball back together and super gluing the ceramic baseball without throwing any pieces away, right? So that's what therapy is, and that's what coaching and therapy and all the things that we can do then come into play. And we'll do another video with various kinds of therapy that we can use later on. Hopefully this has been helpful. I want to thank you for listening and hope you come back sometime. Talk to you later. Bye.